Asia News.
The China War. But these scenes of desolation are the work not of armies, but of nature. The Yellow River is in flood, driving hundreds of thousands from their homes and delaying the Japanese advance. Both Chinese and Japanese are accused of causing the breach, but the Yellow River has a way of breaking its own banks. Here is an actual gap with water streaming through and Chinese soldiers trying vainly to dam the flow. War-weary men struggling against the river vast as a sea. Whoever is conqueror in this war, he won't conquer the Yellow River. And so another migration is underway of villagers seeking dry land. Yet the plight of this homeless multitude doesn't seem as pitiable as other refugees whose pictures we have seen. A flood commissioner has taken charge and harangues the village elders. Then there is a dole for relief, money to keep them alive, old and young, in spite of everything, in spite of the tide of the river and the tide of war.
Vichy claims to be neutral, but it's a fine neutrality that permits Japan to use French Indochina as her base against Britain and America. Japanese troops have been pouring into Indochina, which has become a jumping-off place for attacks against the Philippines, Malaya, Sarawak, Siam and Burma. As for Siam, another self-styled neutral, who frequently announced her intention of defending herself against aggression, she too has given way. Here's part of the Siamese army parading in Bangkok. Well, the army and everything else in Siam is now, to all intents and purposes, Japanese.
Forward. But the war in China remains an ugly thing. Here are the first pictures of Canton's fate. Flames destroy large areas of the city. Fires lighted by the retreating Chinese turn streets into blazing ruin. War material is abandoned to the invader, and here a hangar at the aerodrome is just a burnt-out skeleton. That prop may move, but the plane will never fly again. Following their spectacular capture of Canton, the Japanese at last enter Hankow, which has held out for months. Fires have ravaged this city, too, once the capital of China. The troops clean up in the battle-scarred streets, taking prisoners among the ruins and the rubble. But China fights on, despite her loss.
Japanese aggression has once again become headline news. Not because of anything fresh in China, but because the new Japanese government is a full-blooded, militaristic, pro-Axis government. General Tojo says Japan will continue to work for the prosperity of all the peoples of Asia. The peoples of Asia will be more than sorry to hear it. The indomitable people of China, at any rate, well know the kind of prosperity that Japan has brought to their ancient land. Japanese aggression continues, but the democratic powers of the Pacific have been making a combined plan to resist aggression should it spread further. Japan is a naval power, and her navy has played a part in the aggression against China. But if Japan takes the plunge into the world war of the Axis, that navy will have to play a very much bigger part than it has ever played before. The army has been unable so far to liquidate the Chinese incident, an incident now called an affair, which has already lasted as long as World War #1. Before they take the plunge, Japanese warlords would be well advised to think again.
News from the east is still war news. Battleships of Japan are hovering around the China coast, and at Langfang, Marines are landed. They transfer into troop trains under heavy protection. They are bound for the front line, and they must go unmolested. It is the old story of protecting national interests and looking for threats, sometimes imaginary, which kindles the war flame. While the armies face one another on the front, world attention is fixed on cosmopolitan Shanghai, whence European nationals are being evacuated. Britain, France, and America would guarantee Japanese interests there if both China and Japan withdrew their troops. But the Mikado seems to prefer to protect his own interests, and so the men still pour in, and the guns.
The war goes on in China. Each side draws in its belt and hardens its heart. Amazingly to the Japanese, the Chinese show not only prolonged powers of resistance, but the ability to fight. And Chiang Kai-shek's troops, moving up by train along the Langhai Railway, go forward to achieve their first positive success of the war so far. Soldiers scatter from railway trucks as Japanese bombers are sighted, but this time the machines are only on reconnaissance. No bombs fall. Through the wrecked town of Taichuan creep the infantry, and in the distance you can see the burst of a Japanese shell. Taichuan has changed hands several times. It was here that the Chinese definitely threw the invaders back with considerable losses. Witness these Japanese tanks captured by the Chinese and these ammunition limbers. But of course the daily news from China is still the civilian death row. These pitiable pictures were taken after a raid on Suzhou. They might equally have been in Canton, towards which city war from the air has now turned. The war goes on in China.
It's worse than frayed tempers in China. It's war. Every day brings news of fighting, and swiftly the scene changes. From the Japanese swoop on Peking to the bombardment of Shanghai and the attack on Nanking. The soldiers of Japan, trained, disciplined, and equipped like Western troops, advance. And although they have met stubborn resistance from the Chinese, they are likely in the end to obtain their objectives. What their ultimate aim may be, or whether the war can be isolated as an oriental quarrel between Japanese and Chinese, remains to be seen. Meanwhile, Britain's anxieties for her nationals in China.
Meanwhile, the big guns of the Japanese army bombard the defenses of Suzhou. The artillery opens the way for the advance on the city. Victory here is not with the big battalions, but with the weight of war material. Chinese resistance has stiffened since the beginning of this undeclared war. Here and there on the enormous battlefront, China has even stopped the invader and recaptured positions. But the recent Japanese push has proved successful. Over the battered walls, the tanks move in to find the ruins of an ancient city smashed, empty.
Japan moves in to protect Indochina. What against? The threat of British aggression. Weak French administrators supinely accept Japanese occupation and the fiction of Japanese protection. Imagine the feelings of French officers betrayed by the government at Vichy and forced to facilitate the plans of those who are working against France and her former allies. These are scenes when the French took the first step down the slippery path to occupation, admitting the Japanese to northern Indochina. Now the Yellow Empire extends its encroachments into the southern part of the country, where its air fleets and ships may menace Singapore or Burma.
On the northern battlefront, the Japanese press their advance into Hubei. A Chinese train bombed by warplanes is searched, and out come bags of rice. The railway track has to be repaired, and Chinese help in the work. Down below is the Chinese system of trenches guarding a populous city. Its ancient castle cannot resist the onslaught of the modern Japanese army. The city is taken. Flags of the rising sun greet the Japanese troops, and a halt is called for a Thanksgiving ceremony at a shrine before the advance continues. The eyes of the British Empire focus on Hong Kong. A British possession, it stands the risk of exposure to the war in China, just as the international settlement in Shanghai was exposed. The anti-aircraft batteries guarding the harbour are on the alert because belligerent aeroplanes may fly over British territory, and Indian troops hold manoeuvres on the island. Hong Kong is the port for Canton, now threatened with capture by the Japanese, so Britain keeps her guns ready.
Eyes turn to Japan. Militarized and disciplined, the island empire of the East enforces her demands on China and remains in a constant state of preparedness for whatever fate may bring. In this picture, the Emperor sits his white horse at a review of cadets training at the Japanese Sandhurst to become officers of the Mikado's army. And in a military career, there is no more honorable calling in Japan. And the seal of honor is placed upon a cadet's training when his emperor watches him ride past in faultless formation.
Change in the Far Eastern Command. General Matsui, the Japanese leader who conquered Chinese Shanghai and drove on to the Chinese capital, Nanking, returns to Tokyo superseded. In other words, no can do. News of the Sino-Japanese undeclared war has died down, but lately word comes of a Chinese success in Shantung, almost coinciding with the arrival home of General Matsui to report to the Emperor. The price of war. Even the victors have dead who must be buried and honored in death. So the ashes of Japanese soldiers killed in the China fighting return to their homeland. Cars laden with the urns of 450 officers and men drive through the streets of Yokohama while the inhabitants bow their heads in reverent silence. For the Japanese, their war is just.
In the Far East, snow covers many of the battlefields as the Japanese Alpine troops make wintertime attacks, despite the difficulties of transport in this rugged country. Their objective is a mountain stronghold grimly defended by Chinese guerrilla forces. Thus, with isolated battles in remote provinces, the Sino-Japanese war continues. From the Far East come pictures of the ravage of Canton. Warnings have sounded, and in the streets men and women are on the run. The rivers are full of small craft wherein the frightened people seek to escape from the peril over the city. And here are the raiders, 4 men in a couple of machines terrifying thousands. Such are the odds in modern warfare. Then the bombs fall. The objective of the bombs is the great Canton railway station, and to show you the accuracy of modern bomb sighting, here is all that remains of it blasted to hell. Of course, not every missile hit the target. Canton's casualties were not less than 2,000 dead in 4 days of raids, and the big civilian death roll was interpreted in many quarters as a deliberate attempt to intimidate. You see, anxiety to save the city might detach the governor of Canton, seen here, from support of Chiang Kai-shek.
And the war continues with the accompaniment of all those discomforts which we remember, in particular mud. The Japanese reach the Yellow River and find the railway bridge blown up. They construct a substitute, since the plans of the generals now extend beyond the occupation of North China. As originally forecast, it seemed that they would stop at the Yellow River, but now they sweep on to link up with the armies which have taken Shanghai and Nanking. Britain's General Telfer Smythe.
After the capture of Chapay, devastation. The commercial press building, battered by shell and bomb, bears witness to the ruin of war. And here the tide of battle swept over European and American property during the fiercest of the fighting north of the international settlement. The North State, a target for bombers, was smashed to bits. These steel rails were a Chinese defense against Japanese tanks. Right up to the settlement and even across the boundary road, the scene is one of desolation and havoc, with dud shells a lasting menace. From Shanghai, the Japanese are pushed on towards Nanking, while the survivors of the famous Chinese doomed battalion are interned in the British concession. Russians in British uniforms, members of the Shanghai Defense Force, are their guards. Japanese troops patrol the streets of Shanghai, while in the harbour, led by the flagship Izumo, the powerful warships of Japan menace Shanghai with the threat of shelling by giant naval guns. The city itself, turned from a beautiful and flourishing metropolis into a derelict battleground, now sees the tragic exodus of its Chinese population, a stream of refugees. Fires follow bombardment, completing the work of destruction, till Shanghai becomes a lurid monument to the horror and havoc of modern war. The fires are left to burn themselves out, while the fierce conflict flames up on some other sector of the blazing battlefront.
In flames again. History repeats itself with a vengeance, and Movieturne's film record of the 1932 Sino-Japanese clash in Shanghai tells the lurid story of the present crisis. Already the tragic native quarter to the north of the international settlement is being shelled by the Japanese, and the menace of a war that has been looming over China for years now threatens Shanghai with a repetition of the terrors that the city knows so well, or even worse. At the borders of the settlements, barricades are erected again, and on the presence of the British, American and French forces, the safety of the inhabitants depends. But with Japan seemingly in the mood for violent measures against what she describes as China's provocative attitude, the question to be answered is whether the councils of peace may yet avert the tragedy of actual war. Will the storm blow itself out, or shall we see again the panic rush of Chinese civilians to the protection afforded by foreign powers? And will it stop there, or will the temper of the Japanese involve the other nations in an oriental quarrel, the end of which no man can foretell?
In the Huangpu River lie the warships of Britain and America and Japan to protect their nationals in Shanghai. The Japanese ships are the targets for the Chinese bombers, but the American cruiser Augusta was hit by an anti-aircraft shell. Japanese batteries are on the lookout for Chinese planes, and here they come, bombers. British Movietone News records in these first authentic pictures the actual scene at Shanghai as the bombs aimed at the Japanese warships missed their target but burst in the docks. Part of the waterfront held by the Japanese is wrecked. And there's havoc in the Japanese concession. With modern war let loose on Shanghai, the international settlement cannot escape the consequences of war as bombs and shells crash. The Cathay Hotel is hit, Shanghai's biggest hotel, crowded with guests, when a huge aerial torpedo strikes it. Another falls on the pavement outside. Death and destruction follow, and a street panic, as terrified people rush blindly in the vain search for safety. The bombing of the Cathay Hotel shocked the world, and these pictures have been rushed to the screen by ship and plane to portray with all the vivid truth of an eyewitness the senseless horror of war. And here's a big department store, another catastrophe of the first big battle of Shanghai. It was hit by shell fire in a wild duel of big guns, Chinese and Japanese, in Nanking Road, which runs from the famous Shanghai Bund. Casualties here in the busy center of the shopping district were terrible. Under fire, the foreigners, mostly British and American, evacuate the settlement. They have their navies to help them out and take the women and children to safety. Only the men who must stay remain behind. Here are hundreds on their way to an American liner which will have to run the gauntlet of war in the Huangpu and the Yangtze before the war is left astern. But for the Chinese there is no escape. The war goes on though there has been no declaration of war. As the millions of China resist the might of Japan, thousands must suffer in a war for which they are not responsible. Burning ruins. That's the story from China's latest capital, Chongqing. The raiders from the sky carried out a series of bombing attacks on Chiang Kai-shek's headquarters, and this was the result. 16,000 people killed, and nearly half the city burned. The British and French consulates are among the first buildings to have suffered. Even the German consulate has not been immune. Or this, the warehouse of an American firm, William Hunt and Company. The French church has been completely wrecked. Such destruction means that 1 million people must fly further into the interior, refugees from invasion. marching feet of a conqueror. Across the vast territory of China, the tread of Japanese legions heralds another of the great conquests of history. Relentless, inexorable. Only one thing might stop this advance: intervention by a great power willing to risk war. Such intervention might have been caused by the incident which it is the function of this film to describe. But the hosts of Japan march on. Assuredly, it is history which we are watching in this theatre today. Here are scenes which we have already shown you on other occasions, and we repeat them because this much publicized film, which you have probably made an effort to come and see, is an opportunity not only to tell the story of the bombing of an American gunboat, but to remind you of the reality of events taking place at this moment, at this hour, over a wide sector of the civilized world. And it is the camera alone which makes possible this reproduction of contemporary history. If the knowledge which a realistic film diffuses, if the emotions excited by it mean anything to you, remember this to the credit of films and the men who go out and make them. Among the pictures which Movie Tone's contingent of cameramen have sent back from the theatre of war into this peaceful theatre, already some have been sensational. The accidental bombing of the international settlement by Chinese aeroplanes, and the siege of the doomed battalion in Chapay, with the Japanese soldiers sprinting forward to an assault on the isolated warehouse. This last was shot by Eric Mayle, an Englishman whose lot it was a few weeks later to be travelling aboard the U.S. gunboat Panay, steaming her way up the Yangtze after the fall of Nanking. Throughout the days prior to the city's collapse, refugees had been swarming over the boats on the river, pleading for sanctuary. Among the shipping, observe a white two-funneled vessel, which is the Panay. "25 miles upriver from Nanking, the Panay lay at anchor near 3 American oil tankers. The weather was clear, visibility was good. Suddenly aeroplanes appeared overhead. Japanese aircraft had orders to attack any ship moving on the Yangtze, and the British gunboat Ladybird had already been severely hit while escorting British vessels from the danger zone. The rights of neutral powers in China are well defined, and the gunboats were there to ensure the safety of their nationals. The Japanese authorities were fully conversant with the positions of the ships, and the Panay was at anchor. Suddenly out of the sky swooped Japanese bombers, and at once the water around the stationary vessels was spattered with explosives. Swiftly the Lewis guns came into action, and minutes of breathtaking tragedy followed. One of the first bombs struck the Panay and put the engines out of action, lacerating her deck and wounding, among others, her commander. Men struck by splinters carried on. The Lewis gunners stuck to their vain task. Soon it became clear that the Panay was doomed, and the order to abandon ship was written on the deck by an officer who had been wounded in the throat, and so was unable to give the order verbally. The injured, who numbered 60% of the ship's complement, were got away into the 2 small boats to make for shore nearly a mile away. Imagine the horror of attempting to escape in such appalling conditions under the machine gun fire, or so it is alleged, of Japanese units. To reach safety, one man at least had thrown himself overboard to swim in the freezing stream. And all the time the Panay settles lower in the water, her foremast broken in 2, her decks littered with empty cartridge cases, her guns, now silent, pointing with aimless irony at the sky. Each boat makes several trips, and the last load of casualties leaves the Panay. Down she goes. Survivors watch the doom of their ill-fated ship with the chagrin which only a sailor can feel at such a loss. From the bank, Eric Mayle, who took these pictures, continues filming the grim scene. It is stated by observers that a Japanese boat put out from the shore and turned a machine gun on the ship as she was sinking. Was this the Japanese boat in question? In the high reeds which fringe the shores of the great river, a period of stoic heroism and silent suffering ensues, as each boatload of survivors finds a haven of refuge at the creek side. Such medical assistance as can be rendered is the next task of the unscathed, and doctors give succor in this unparalleled and unforeseeable situation. A compatriot bends over Sandro Sandri, Italian newspaperman, who lies in agony on his side, mortally wounded. There is cheery fortitude in evidence, and one casualty sends a wave of reassurance to the audiences of the world. And in the meanwhile, the Panay has gone. The only remaining signs of the outrage on the Yangtze, the burning oil tankers beached on the opposite shore. The work of evacuating the foreign little party starts, and fearful of attacks being renewed, the order is to proceed inland to the nearest village. 5 miles of weary trudging brings them to Hosien, where the casualties are set down on their stretchers. Lieutenant Anders, who, wounded in the throat, chalked the order to abandon ship on the deck, lights a cigarette with both hands heavily bandaged. From Hosien, the journey is continued by canal to Han Shan, another 20 miles, and sampans, or open junks, provide the transport, a difficult journey to comparative safety. After this incredible onslaught from a sudden and almost unseen enemy, the immunity from immediate danger must have spelt relief. But we can imagine how, when so much that was unexpected had happened in so short a time, the survivors of the tragedy must have wondered whether they were to reach their goal alive. Here the story is nearly ended. The furor aroused by the incident having checked the zeal of irresponsible Japanese airmen, the survivors are transferred aboard British and American gunboats at Hosien. The scene moves to Shanghai, and from aboard the United States cruiser Augusta, we watch the approach of HMS Ladybird with the first survivors. Mayle and Admiral Yarnell, commanding the American squadron, discuss the terrible experience which has embittered the relations of America and Japan. And past the Japanese battleship Itzumo, with her flag at half-mast, comes the Ladybird. British gunboats played a part in this episode, which we should only have expected American vessels to play had the positions been reversed. Saluted by the American Navy, coffins are laid on the deck of the American flagship, while the international issue, raised by the outrage, racks the sentiments of law-abiding nations. But for the forbearance of the American government and people, the incident described by these pictures might have begun yet another major chapter of history. As you may remember, Japan apologized.
It was a great mistake. It was an unintentional and unexpected occurrence. The Japanese government and people wished to express their sincerest and profoundest regrets to the American government and people on account of this deplorable incident.
General Matsui and General Telfer Smollett, after the fall of Shanghai. Foreign officers, British, American and French, visit the victorious leader of the Mikado's troops and salutes are exchanged. In Nanking, Madame Chiang Kai-shek recuperates after a car accident. Her husband, the Chinese Generalissimo, inspects pilots and planes at the airport from which he and his wife escaped by air just before the city fell to the invader for the first time in its history. The Purple Mountain, with the tomb of Sun Yat-sen, father of the Chinese Revolution, was occupied during the Japanese advance on Nanking. The tomb is virtually China's national monument. These pictures of Chinese troops marching out from Tung Quan on the Yellow River are the first shots to be made on this sector of the northern front. Back in Shanghai, floods follow the ravages of war. But there's a lighter side. Watch here, Skinny. Even the rickshaw boys are laughing.
In Shanghai, the undeclared war continues as Japanese shells aimed at Putang from the river kindle fires in the Chinese quarter. What remained of the docks after earlier attacks is bombarded afresh, and Chinese river traffic is paralyzed as junks go up in flames. In the streets, there is a rush for shelter, and not until the bombardment ceases can the spread of fire be checked. In spite of protests registered by neutral powers, Tokyo has replied that her policy must continue. And so from the river, the guns go on barking. The American flagship stands by the international settlement, which looks comparatively peaceful, but over the Chinese city hangs a pall of smoke.
Now the Far East, where the war in China dominates all thoughts. At Hong Kong, near the Chinese frontier, trench digging by the Rajputana Rifles is one item in Britain's defensive program. With Japan threatening the capture of Canton, the British colony looks to its security. Local volunteers are on the alert, and training with gas masks is the order of the day. These men, in times of peace, carry on their business as traders, merchants, and officials. Today, they bring their knowledge of the art of war up to date. Machine gun and gas mask take the place of telephone and typewriter. If need arises, the civilians of Hong Kong will be ready to fall in beside the regular garrison, which includes the Middlesex Regiment, the famous diehards. From news that the Japanese have at last made substantial progress on the Shanghai front. The move forward calls for readjustments behind the lines, and the advance of units to new positions marches hand in hand with an extension of the supply services. Watertight communications are vital to military organization, and while lookout men scan the terrain, motorcyclists keep touch with headquarters. Dogs, too, are an important link in the intelligence system, carrying messages through the danger zone. Highly trained, loyal creatures, each man whatever his motive and whatever the danger. And so the organization behind the lines keeps the guns trained on the defending front. Undeterred by mistaken targets, civilian damage, or injury to Europeans, the Japanese planes return again and again to the attack and rain destruction on the city. Just another explosion, just another fire in Shanghai's unhappy story. The troops advance, openly and easily in the country, slowly and stealthily in the city. And Shanghai, cosmopolitan and once glamorous city of the Orient, witnesses street fighting, another horror of the ancient game of war brought up to date with modern artillery. the international settlement marched the Japanese in a march of victory to celebrate the success of their arms in China, a march which everyone knew was bound to provoke trouble. In spite of warnings by the settlement authorities, the Japanese marched, and a bomb was thrown. Consternation spreads among the crowd which has heard the explosion, but the police keep their heads and order is maintained. Troops hurry to the spot and patrols seize the area with fixed bayonets and drawn revolvers. It's a moment of crisis not only there in the streets of Shanghai, but also in international relations. And when the Japanese soldiers march on, it's with some apprehension. In the Yangtze, there's a rush to escape from the Chinese capital, Nanking, before the Japanese take it. Refugees almost swamping the boats. Further downriver, the Japanese tow away a ship they have seized. Of those two white gunboats, the one with a single funnel is HMS B, and then a glimpse of the USS Panay, the white vessel in the distance. Pictures of the attack on the Panay, shot by a movie-tone cameraman on board, are on their way to this screen. Ships of all nations crowd the river, their nationalities very clearly indicated. Would you mistake that British vessel, or that German? In Tokyo, the German-Japanese anti-communist pact is celebrated with the huge Korakuen Stadium packed by citizens waving flags and shouting "Banzai" for the Emperor, Hitler and Mussolini. In the German embassy, Prince Chichibu is entertained, the Mikado's brother drinking a... Our front-page news today comes from distant places. Tsingtao, the city in China that the Kaiser built. These frowning turrets are fortifications of the pre-war German outpost, and their guns are silent. Not a shot was fired at the Japanese warships in the harbor. All the Chinese defenders did before they left was to create desolation and scuttle ships. And so the Japanese captured Tsingtao for the second time. They took it from the Germans during the World War, then had to hand it back to the Chinese. Since the war period, they have owned considerable property in Tsingtao, factories, mills and depots. These the Chinese mined and blew up before they departed.
万世に開拓すべく努められることを絶望いたす次第であります。
Thus, the Secretary of the Japanese Navy defines its policy as defensive, pure non-aggression, in fact. But Japan, while steadily building up a more and more powerful navy and training every branch of the service in the most modern methods, also talks glibly of a new order in the Far East. And that's presumably why all these warlike preparations continue at such a hot pace. For the new order, like the new order in China, perhaps. Japan is said to have at least 4 new battleships comparable with the Bismarck, building or completed. But she's not by any means well off in raw materials. She's still at grips with China, and at the moment she's in a somewhat isolated position. So even if her policy is one of wait and see, yet she doesn't mean to give way in the battle of armaments. Although these are recent pictures of her fleet, it's obvious that great secrecy is being maintained over new construction. Not for one moment does British or American naval strategy fail to appreciate possible plans for a new order in the Pacific. It's the turn of Hong Kong to feel uneasy as the Far Eastern War moves towards Canton. Jack Tar, of course, is the man to deal with the situation, and sailors from the ships of the China Station rehearse their part in the defense plans ashore. Naturally, the Marines go wherever the Navy goes, and are received by Vice Admiral Crabbe, on whose shoulders falls the responsibility of protecting the colony. The sailors return to their ships for the present. In the occupied areas of China, the puppet regime set up by Japan take over in Peking, and its officials register their authority in the streets of the old capital. At Nanking, too, a new regime is in charge, and the conquering arm of General Iwani Matsui holds sway. The Japanese take formal possession, while the remnant of China plans guerrilla warfare.
A new competitor arrives in Fremantle to enter the Antarctic whaling industry. From Japan come 8 chasers and a factory ship, which is the last word in whaler construction. On her 100-yard deck, she can deal with 3 of the mighty mammals in half an hour. Observe the huge slipway up which the prizes are drawn. But first to catch them. The chasers mark down their prey, and then it's a case for the man at the harpoon gun. Got him. And there's another. Fire. That's how whales are hunted. The British and Norwegians observe a sort of closed season. The Japanese don't agree. They just go on hunting.
Japanese troops move forward with Shanghai as their goal. Movie-Tone's cameraman is with the forces north of the city as they play their part in the plan to isolate Shanghai by encirclement. Through the flooded rice fields they tramp on, their immediate objective the little town of Tangquan-Tun. The Chinese trench has to be negotiated, and onward through fields of ripening crops the war machine moves, sometimes slowly but always ruthlessly. Infantry movements made with the cooperation of air observers and the protection of artillery. And while the land troops close in from the north, the Mikado's gunboats continue to bombard the riverfront. The Western world looks on with growing anxiety. From Geneva comes news that a 9-power conference will be summoned. And Tokyo, with her ear to the Pacific, must surely heed the strong words which President Roosevelt has spoken. But meanwhile, the troops occupy Tangquan-Tun and achieve yet another step. Must Japan push on, or will she yet lead the way in a retreat from chaos? And finally, to conclude this reel, we bring to your eye, ear and mind some fresh material from China to stimulate reflection. The bombing aeroplane, war's greatest agent of destruction, wings on its mission to attack military objectives behind the enemy lines. Unusual as are these pictures, the first ever filmed from a battle plane during a bombing raid of actual war, the marvel of them as pictures will probably be lost in the thought of the appalling terror there below as we fly overhead. Your imagination may perhaps hark back to President Roosevelt's words at the beginning of this reel. These pictures show that railway lines, a legitimate military objective, have been hit. But we are led to wonder, was that all? Who will guarantee that hundreds of innocent lives were not massacred by one stray missile that missed its mark?
From the Japanese emperor downwards, the Japanese people, by their treacherous attack on America and on Britain, have marked a day that will live in infamy. These aggressors of the Orient have obviously nothing to learn from Germany in the matter of dishonor. Japan is a strong power that's got to be broken. That's the business in hand now. She has a big fleet whose fighting quality still remains to be tested. A big fleet which certainly will be put to the test. That Japan will fight with all the ruthless ferocity of the Han himself, we already know. Haven't Shanghai and a score of cities provided the evidence? Aggression, with its attendant trail of misery, has got to be stamped out. And 4/5 of humanity are on our side in this resolve. The war has spread right round the world, and now the Pacific Ocean forms the vast new battle area. Japan has thrown down the challenge, and the people of Japan support the suicidal ambitions of their militaristic leader. Nor has this idea of challenging the other Pacific powers arisen overnight. Years before we formed our ARP services, Japan, like Germany, was practicing defense against air raids. Witness this old picture of a mock attack on Tokyo. Now, of course, Tokyo may expect the real thing. Japan struck first. From French Indochina, Japanese aircraft and Japanese soldiers have been killing and plundering peace-loving peoples. With France too weak to resist, Japan is well established here. From here, she has bombed the Burma Road, but China continues to build it up again, and war material continues to go through. Now, at last, full aid is coming to the heroic Chinese, and not only by the Burma Road. Japan invaded Malaya and bombed Singapore, and will bomb it again. For Singapore, our £20 million base is one of the strongest vetoes on Japanese aggression. Here, under Air Marshal Brooke Popham, commanding our forces in the Far East, resistance to the Germans of the East has crystallized. Here already, Ack gunners are in action. Japan bombed Manila, capital of the Philippines, which under American guidance have grown to the stature of self-government. America will finally ensure their independence. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor near Honolulu in Hawaii, the American naval and air base. All this without breaking off negotiations then in progress. Indeed, a Japanese note was received after the first bombing. But America, now fully united, will remember, and we shall remember. American sea power plus British sea power will win the day, as President Roosevelt himself has predicted.
As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. But always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
Japanese planes and Japanese guns in the advance in Tientsin. Movie Turn's authentic film dispatch from the Northern Front shows the actual fighting on the outskirts of the great seaport, one of the most important points in the Japanese plan to absorb the 5 northern provinces. From Tientsin, and the railway runs to the old capital of China, Peiping, and is controlled by Japanese troops while Tientsin station goes up in flames. The Chinese population runs the gauntlet of war, while 3,000 Chinese soldiers are taken prisoner and listen with Oriental stoicism to the harangue of a Japanese official. Prisoners of war, and so out of the war.
It is no act of God, but warplanes that bring disaster to China. Air raid warnings in the sister cities of Hankow and Wuchang send the inhabitants running for the safety or comparative safety of foreign concessions. Japanese raiders flying high are aiming at the Hankow arsenal and airfield. The people huddle in doorways, under trees, anywhere for shelter, with that resignation which an age-old philosophy and the grim experience of war have taught them. When the raiders have left, the all-clear signal is given, and once again the streets come to life. From the hospitable foreign concessions, refugees come flocking back like ants. Arsenals and airfields are the military objectives, but no airman can be certain of avoiding civilian massacre when homes and hospitals come into the war zone. With scenes like these in mind, how sane appears Britain's policy of appeasement.
In spite of the floods in the north, the undeclared war in China goes on, and the Yangtze River comes into the picture again. Japanese warships fight their way upstream to attack Anqing. A naval contingent is landed some 15 miles below the city, for the drive is a combined attack from the river and ashore. The land forces move up at night against a burning city, and at dawn the capital of Anhui province is taken. Anqing is a key point in the Japanese drive on Chiang Kai-shek's new capital at Hankow. But the invader, in spite of early triumphs, has forced the Chinese to unite, and now every success is a hard-fought victory. Once in Anqing, the Japanese comb the city, but the Chinese have melted away to fight another day in their guerrilla war.
On the other hand, at Hong Kong, British interests are now threatened by the cutting of its railway connections with Canton. The relations of Britain and Japan over this eastern possession of the empire provide yet another embarrassment for Mr. Chamberlain. Meanwhile, the Japanese, preceded up the Yangtze by their warships, close in on Hankow. A landing party attacks a Chinese position. Here you may follow a grim picture of war. The attackers take up strategic positions and bring their machine guns into play. Down below are the Chinese trenches swept by Japanese fire. A Chinese soldier flees in the distance before the Japanese advance. Japanese marksmen aim a hail of bullets, and he falls. Chinese defenders give themselves up. Watch that first prisoner there. For some reason, some exchange of words perhaps, there's a blow and his Japanese captor strikes him. So the defending position is taken, and the soldiers of Japan march on.
With the city of Peking already under Japanese control, troops continue to pour into China from Japan. Whether recent disturbances between the two countries will result in openly declared war is still uncertain. At any rate, mobilization is proceeding on a nationwide basis in Japan, and the influx of troops has a sinister look. China's aspect is as warlike as that of Japan, as her armies massing near the border of the province of Hubei march along the Great Wall. General Sung is the local commander. Chiang Kai-shek, China's premier and generalissimo, inspects the Chinese Air Force and troops. The general has declared that negotiations for a peaceful settlement are no longer to be considered. But let's hope a compromise may eventually be reached.
From Shanxi province, China, comes a grim picture of aerial warfare in stern reality. Japanese planes take off on a bombing expedition, loaded to capacity with their cargo of death and destruction. In formation, the machines fly swiftly toward their objective, which is situated in the town of Liaoyang. In a moment, you will see a rain of bombs descending. Down below, anti-aircraft batteries flash, but the bombers are untouched. As you watch the explosions in terrifying concentration down there, you may well wonder what would be the effect of raids on a city by literally hundreds of machines.
Out of a clear sky came the treacherous Japanese attack on Hawaii. The homes of Waikiki, famous in song, are burning fiercely from the bombs dropped by those planes. The whole world knows now how Japan assaulted the American naval base without warning, without a declaration of war, and while her envoys were actually negotiating in Washington. No wonder the people of Hawaii were bewildered by this sudden, unexpected blow. These pictures show something of how the civil population suffered. As for military and naval damage, that of course is covered by censorship for the same reasons of security which apply in Britain. Naturally, exact details would be very useful to the enemy. Apart from bombing attacks, the Japanese machine-gunned city streets. Here's the proof. Magnificent work was done by civil defense organizations. Among the buildings to which they were called was a wrecked school. Britain knows only too well what all this means. We can and do sympathize with all our hearts. The Japanese used very small two-man submarines in their attack. One of them was beached and captured. But most of the damage appears to have been caused by aircraft.
Climax so far of the war in China, Shanghai falls in desolation after weeks of bombardment. But the famous Suicide Battalion fights on, while Movietone's cameraman, Eric Mayle, makes an amazing film record of this nightmare siege. Again and again, Japanese infantry storm the warehouse with rifles and machine guns, but still the Suicide Battalion fights on, its heroism admired by the world. So Chapei, Chinese city of Shanghai, falls in flames. Refugees walk the planks in dismal procession, while Tommy gives a helping hand to the safety of the British concession, its defence under the command of Major General Telfer Smollett. It will go down in history as the Great Fire of Shanghai, but not started by accident. A smoke pall rings down the curtain on a great city's tragedy. But in Tokyo there is carnival, celebration of victory. Colorful processions by day, lanterns by night. Easy to catch the gaiety of the crowds, if only we can forget those other crowds marching to a grimmer tune. China's millions in flight. It's a flight from war and far, broken bodies still hoping to live. And a flight of new life, helpless and unknowing, in the dismal struggle to survive.
In the Far East, war continues, and the Japanese attack the important city of Nanchang, a strategic point in South China. The Chinese defense is resolute. They've blown up the bridge across the Kiang River. This impedes but doesn't stop the Japanese, who cross the stream, tanks and all. It's just one incident in the struggle, but it points to the fact that the Japanese have their hands full in China and don't want to be involved in a European war as well. They capture Nanchang, now a ruined city, and take dozens of prisoners. The Chinese fight as regular soldiers and as guerrillas. To so vast a population, the loss of thousands of prisoners means little.
While pacts are being signed, the bombing in China goes on. Planes roar over Chapei, the northern district of Shanghai that has already suffered so severely, and drop their terrifying missiles aimed at strategic points. After the bombs come tanks and artillery in the Japanese attack that finally carried Chapei. And after the bombs, havoc. Near this building, 3 British soldiers lost their lives. And here the German flag flies over these ruins, while pacts are being signed. In Yangtze-ku, near the city, Chinese are fed by Japanese troops. Stoically, they refuse to leave, so their captors